The battlefield is chaos. Roman legions are pinned down, shields locked, pressed against an enemy that won't break. The centurions are shouting orders, but the line is faltering. Blood mixes with mud, steel clashes against steel, and then from the river behind them something emerges. Not boats, not rafts, men, hundreds of them, swimming through the current in full armor, weapons strapped to their backs, moving like predators through water. They hit the enemy flank like a hammer. Within minutes, the battle is over. These are not Romans, they are Batavians, and they are the most feared fighting force in the Roman military. Trusted more than Roman citizens, deployed where the fighting is worst, answering only to the emperor himself. Roman generals watch them with a mixture of awe and unease, because elite troops who operate outside normal command are useful. Until they are not, and one day the Batavians turned on Rome. This is their story. To understand why Rome feared the Batavians, you have to understand who they were. The Batavians were a Germanic tribe from the Rhine Delta, in what is now the Netherlands. They lived in a landscape of rivers, marshes, and islands. Water was their element. They were warriors by culture, fiercely proud, and extraordinarily skilled. When Rome expanded into Germania, most tribes resisted. The Batavians did not. They saw an opportunity. Rome needed soldiers. The Batavians had them. So a deal was struck. The Batavians would not be conquered. They would be recruited. This was not a typical Roman arrangement. The Batavians were given a privileged status, unlike almost any other tribe in the empire. They were exempt from taxes. They paid Rome not in coin, but in men. Every generation, the Batavians sent their finest warriors to serve in the Roman military. And Rome accepted, because these men were exceptional. This was not subjugation. This was partnership. And it made the Batavians different from the start. They were auxiliaries, yes, but they were elite auxiliaries. They kept their own commanders. They maintained their own identity. They wore their own symbols. And they fought with a ferocity that made them legendary. The Batavians were not just good soldiers. They were specialists in a form of warfare that terrified everyone else. Amphibious warfare. Rivers were barriers to most armies. To the Batavians, they were highways. They could swim across rivers in full armor. Not just a few men, entire cohorts. Hundreds of warriors cross in fast-moving water, shields on their backs, swords at their sides, emerging on the opposite bank, ready to fight. This was not a trick. This was training, discipline. A warrior culture that had adapted to the environment of the Rhine Delta, and Rome used it ruthlessly. When Roman legions needed to cross a defended river, the Batavians went first. When an enemy thought a water barrier would protect them, the Batavians proved them wrong. They were shock troops, deployed at the critical moment, sent into the worst fighting, used to break enemies that regular legions could not. And they were devastatingly effective. Roman commanders learned quickly, when you need something impossible done, you send the Batavians. But this created a problem. Elite troops develop elite reputations, and elite reputations create resentment. Roman soldiers were proud. They considered themselves the best in the world. But even they knew the Batavians were different, more dangerous, more feared, and that created tension. The Batavians were organized into cohorts, like other auxiliary units, but their cohorts were larger, better equipped, better paid. They had a reputation for discipline that rivaled the legions themselves. This was unusual for auxiliaries, who were often seen as less professional than Roman citizens. But the Batavians were not typical auxiliaries. They were an elite force that operated semi-independently. And this is where the relationship with Roman generals became complicated. In theory, auxiliary cohorts were under the command of Roman officers. In practice, the Batavians answered to their own leaders who had direct relationships with Roman emperors. This was intentional. Rome trusted the Batavians more than it trusted its own generals. After all, generals could rebel. Generals could seize power. Generals were a threat. But foreign warriors with no claim to Roman political power, they were useful, safe, or so Rome thought. The Batavians were often used as imperial bodyguards. They protected emperors in Rome itself. This was extraordinary. The most powerful men in the world, surrounded by Germanic warriors instead of Roman soldiers. Why? Because the emperors trusted them more. The Batavians had no reason to stage a coup. They had no interest in Roman politics. They were loyal to the deal, the arrangement, the partnership. But this created a strange dynamic. Roman generals commanded legions. The Batavians answered to power. They bypassed normal command structures. They operated outside the usual military hierarchy. And this made Roman officers uneasy. An elite unit that does not fully answer to you is a dangerous thing, especially when that unit is more effective than your own men. The Batavians proved their worth across the empire. They fought in Britain during the Claudian invasion in 43 A.D. The Roman legions crossed the Thames, but the river was defended. The Batavians swam across in full armor, surprising the British defenders and securing the crossing. It was a decisive moment in the campaign. They fought on the Rhine frontier, where their knowledge of the terrain and the rivers made them indispensable. They served under Agricola in northern Britain, participating in brutal campaigns against the Caledonians. They were deployed in Germania, in Gaul, in Pannonia. Wherever Rome needed shock troops, the Batavians were sent, and they delivered. Their reputation grew with every campaign. Stories spread. The warriors who could cross any river, the troops who never broke, the cohorts that emperors trusted with their lives. But reputation is a double-edged sword, because the more Rome depended on the Batavians, the more vulnerable it became, and the Batavians knew it. By the middle of the 1st century A.D., the Batavians were at the peak of their power. 8 cohorts of Batavian auxiliary troops were stationed across the empire. Thousands of warriors, all elite, all loyal. Or so Rome believed. But loyalty is not unconditional, and the deal that had made the Batavians so powerful was starting to fray. Rome was asking for more men, more cohorts, more sacrifices. The Batavian population was not large. Sending thousands of men to fight Rome's wars was a strain, and Rome was not always respectful. Roman officers sometimes treated Batavian commanders with contempt. Roman soldiers sometimes mocked the Batavians as barbarians. The partnership was becoming exploitation, and the Batavians were proud. Too proud to accept insult, too powerful to be ignored. The situation was volatile. And then Rome made a mistake, a catastrophic mistake. In 69 A.D., the year of the 4 emperors, the Roman Empire tore itself apart. Nero was dead. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian all claimed the throne. Legions fought legions. The empire was distracted, weakened, vulnerable. And the Batavians saw an opportunity. Julius Civilis was a Batavian commander. He had served Rome for decades. He had led Batavian cohorts in battle. He had been trusted by emperors. But he had also been humiliated, accused of treason by a Roman governor, imprisoned, nearly executed. He survived, but the insult burned. Civilis understood something that Rome had forgotten. The Batavians were not subjects, they were partners, and partners can walk away. In 69 AD, while Rome was consumed by civil war, Civilis led the Batavians in revolt. This was not a barbarian uprising. This was a calculated rebellion by one of the most elite military forces in the Roman world. The Batavians knew Roman tactics. They had fought alongside Roman legions for generations. They knew Roman weaknesses, and they exploited them ruthlessly. The revolt began along the Rhine. Batavian cohorts stationed on the frontier turned on their Roman commanders. Forts were overrun, supply lines cut, Roman officers were killed or captured. Other tribes joined the rebellion, the Gauls, the Treveri, the Lingones. But the Batavians were the core, the leadership, the military expertise, and Rome was not ready. The Batavian revolt was a disaster for Rome. 2 Roman legions were defeated, not just defeated, destroyed. The 5th Alaudi and the 15th Primigenia were caught in a siege at Castra Vetera, a massive Roman fortress on the Rhine. The Batavians surrounded it, cut it off, starved it. The legions tried to break out. They failed. They tried to hold. They failed. In the end, the legions surrendered. This was almost unheard of. Roman legions did not surrender, but they surrendered to the Batavians, and the Batavians burned the fortress to the ground. The Rhine frontier collapsed. Roman authority in Germania evaporated. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Batavians might actually drive Rome out of the region. And Rome was terrified, because this was not a barbarian horde. This was a professional military force using Roman tactics against Rome itself. The Batavians were not just dangerous, they were a mirror, a reflection of Rome's own strength turned against it. But Civilis made a mistake. He overreached. The revolt spread beyond the Batavians. Other tribes joined, but they were not as disciplined, not as focused. The rebellion became chaotic, divided, and Rome, once it resolved its civil war, brought its full power to bear. Vespasian became emperor. He sent legions north, fresh troops, commanded by Quintus Petilius Carialis, one of Rome's best generals. The Roman counterattack was methodical, brutal. The Batavians fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered. The rebellion began to crumble. Civilis tried to hold the Rhine, but the Roman legions were relentless. Forts were retaken, tribes were crushed. The revolt, which had seemed so unstoppable, began to collapse. And in 70 AD, Civilis negotiated. He did not surrender. He negotiated. This is important. Because Rome did not crush the Batavians, Rome made a deal, again. The Batavians would return to Roman service. They would provide troops as before, but they would retain their status, their privileges, their identity. Rome needed the Batavians too much to destroy them, and the Batavians were too valuable to waste. So the partnership resumed, but it was different now. Rome had learned a lesson. Elite troops are useful, but elite troops are dangerous, especially when they operate outside your control. After the revolt, the Batavians continued to serve Rome. They fought in Dacia, in Britain, along the Rhine. They remained elite, feared, respected. But Rome never trusted them the same way again. The Batavian cohorts were dispersed, spread across the empire, never concentrated in one place. Their numbers were reduced, their autonomy curtailed. Rome had been reminded of a fundamental truth. When you empower warriors you cannot control, you create a weapon that can turn on you. The Batavians had proven this. They had shown that elite foreign troops could destabilize the empire, and Rome never forgot. Over the following decades, the Batavian presence in the Roman military declined, not because they were defeated, not because they were disloyal, but because they were too dangerous. The partnership that had made them powerful also made them a threat, and Rome, ever pragmatic, reduced that threat. By the 2nd century A.D., the Batavians had faded from prominence. Their cohorts still existed, but they were no longer the elite force they had once been. The Rhine Delta remained part of the empire, but the special status of the Batavians was gone. They had become just another auxiliary tribe, useful, but not exceptional. The story of the Batavians reveals something essential about the Roman Empire. Rome was the greatest military power in the ancient world. But Rome did not conquer alone. It relied on allies, auxiliaries, foreign warriors, and the most elite of these were the Batavians. They were trusted more than Roman citizens, deployed where the fighting was worst, used to protect emperors. But this trust came with a cost, because elite troops develop pride, autonomy, power, and power, if not carefully controlled, becomes a threat. The Batavians were Rome's sharpest blade, but blades can cut both ways. The generals who worked with the Batavians understood this. They saw the effectiveness, the discipline, the fear the Batavians inspired, but they also saw the independence, the semi-autonomous command structure, the loyalty that was not entirely theirs to command. And this made them uneasy. Roman officers were trained to control their men, to dominate the battlefield through discipline and hierarchy. But the Batavians operated differently. They were not Roman. They did not think like Romans. They fought for Rome, but they fought as Batavians. And that distinction mattered. It meant that in moments of crisis, their loyalty was not guaranteed. It meant that their power could not be fully controlled. And for Roman generals, that was a problem, because the best soldiers are only useful if they obey. The Batavians obeyed until they did not. The psychological dimension of the Batavians is crucial. These were men who lived between two worlds. They were warriors of a Germanic tribe, raised with a culture that valued honor, courage, and independence. But they served an empire that demanded obedience, hierarchy, and submission. This created a tension. The Batavians were proud of their service, proud of their reputation, proud of their status. But they were also aware that they were outsiders, that Rome saw them as useful barbarians, that their loyalty was rewarded with privilege, but never with equality. This is the paradox of the elite auxiliary. You are trusted with the most dangerous missions. You are given the best equipment. You are praised for your skill, but you are never fully accepted. You are never truly Roman. And this creates resentment, a sense of being used, of being valued for what you can do, but not for who you are. For the Batavians, this resentment simmered for decades. It was kept in check by the deal, the partnership, the benefits of serving Rome. But when Rome's behavior violated that partnership, the resentment erupted, and the result was catastrophic. The Batavian revolt was not just a military rebellion. It was a statement, a declaration that the Batavians were not subjects, that they had agency, that they could choose to withdraw their service, and Rome, for all its power, could not prevent it. This terrified Roman leaders, because if the Batavians could rebel, so could others. The Praetorian Guard, the German bodyguards, the other elite auxiliary cohorts. The entire system of Roman military power depended on loyalty, and loyalty, the Batavians proved, was conditional. This is why the revolt was so significant. It was not the scale of the destruction, though that was considerable. It was the precedent, the proof that even the most trusted troops could turn. And that changed how Rome managed its military. After the Batavian revolt, Rome became more cautious. Elite auxiliary units were never again given the same level of autonomy. Foreign bodyguards were reduced. The concentration of non-Roman troops near the capital was limited. Rome learned to fear its own strength, or rather, to fear the strength it had borrowed from others. The Rhine Delta, the homeland of the Batavians, was a unique environment. It was a region of rivers, marshes, and islands, a place where water dominated the landscape. This shaped Batavian culture. They were not just comfortable in water, they were masters of it. Their ability to conduct amphibious operations was not a gimmick. It was a fundamental part of their military identity. They trained from childhood to swim in armor, to move through water as easily as on land, to use rivers as tactical advantages rather than obstacles. This made them invaluable to Rome, because rivers were everywhere in the empire: the Rhine, the Danube, the Thames, the Euphrates, and controlling rivers meant controlling territory. The Batavians gave Rome that control. They could cross rivers that other troops could not. They could attack from directions the enemy did not expect. They could turn defensive positions into death traps. And they did this repeatedly across decades of campaigns. But this specialization also made them distinct. The Batavians were not just another auxiliary cohort. They were a unique military asset, and unique assets are difficult to replace. This gave them leverage, power, the ability to negotiate from a position of strength. And when Rome violated the terms of the partnership, the Batavians used that leverage. They withdrew their service. And Rome, suddenly, found itself without the troops it needed most. The relationship between the Batavians and Roman emperors was complex. Emperors valued the Batavians because they were loyal, not to Rome, not to the Senate, not to the legions, but to the emperor himself. This was crucial. In the Roman political system, the emperor's greatest threat came from within, from ambitious generals, from rival claimants, from disloyal troops. But the Batavians had no interest in Roman politics. They could not become emperor. They had no base of support in Rome. They were the perfect bodyguards, loyal, effective, and politically neutral. This is why emperors surrounded themselves with Germanic warriors, why the Batavian cohorts were stationed in Rome, why they were trusted with the most sensitive security assignments. But this arrangement had a flaw. The Batavians were loyal as long as they were respected, as long as the partnership was honored, as long as Rome treated them as equals, at least in military matters. When Rome stopped doing that, the loyalty evaporated, and emperors learned the hard way that even the most trusted troops have limits. The year of the 4 emperors was a lesson in vulnerability. Rome tore itself apart, and the Batavians took advantage, not because they were treacherous, but because Rome had broken the deal. The Batavian cohorts were larger than standard auxiliary units. A typical auxiliary cohort numbered around 500 men. Batavian cohorts were often double that size, 1,000 warriors, heavily armed, superbly trained. This was another mark of their status. They were not just elite. They were organized as an elite force. They had their own officers, their own standards, their own traditions, and they maintained their Germanic identity even while serving Rome. They wore their hair long, They carried their traditional weapons alongside Roman equipment. They spoke their own language. This was tolerated, even encouraged, because it reinforced their warrior culture. Rome understood that the Batavians were effective because they were Batavian, not because they were trying to be Roman. This was a subtle but important distinction. Rome usually tried to Romanize its subjects, to turn them into Romans. The Batavians were not the only elite auxiliary troops in the Roman military. There were others: Syrian archers, Numidian cavalry, Spanish slingers. But none had the same combination of status, autonomy, and reputation. The Batavians were unique. They were the only auxiliary force that served as imperial bodyguards, the only cohorts that operated with such independence, the only foreign troops that Roman generals genuinely feared. This fear was not about combat effectiveness. Roman legions were confident they could defeat anyone. It was about control. The Batavians could not be controlled the way other troops could. They had their own command structure, their own loyalty, their own sense of honor. And this made them unpredictable, useful, but unpredictable. And in a military system built on discipline and hierarchy, unpredictability was dangerous. Roman generals preferred troops they understood, troops that followed orders without question, troops that fit into the system. The Batavians did not fit. They existed outside the system, and that made them powerful. But it also made them a liability. The aftermath of the Batavian revolt reshaped Roman military policy. Rome continued to use auxiliary troops. It had no choice. The legions alone were not enough to defend the empire, but Rome became more careful about how it organized those troops. Auxiliary cohorts were rotated more frequently. Their commanders were watched more closely. Their numbers were controlled. The goal was to prevent any single auxiliary force from becoming too powerful, too independent, too dangerous. The Batavians were the lesson, the warning. They had shown what could happen when elite troops felt betrayed, and Rome was determined not to let it happen again. But this caution came at a cost, because the Batavians had been extraordinarily effective. They had provided capabilities that the legions lacked, and by reducing their autonomy, by dispersing their cohorts, Rome lost some of that effectiveness. It was a trade-off: security over capability, control over performance, and Rome, ever pragmatic, accepted it, because the alternative was too dangerous. The legacy of the Batavians extends beyond their military achievements. They represent a fundamental tension in the Roman Empire. Rome was an empire built on inclusion. It absorbed peoples, cultures, and warriors from across the known world. It turned enemies into allies, barbarians into soldiers. This was Rome's genius, its ability to integrate and utilize the strengths of others. But integration requires trust, and trust requires equality, or at least respect. The Batavians were integrated, they were trusted, but they were never truly equal. They were useful, valued, feared, but not Roman. And this distinction, this subtle but persistent hierarchy, created the conditions for rebellion, because elite warriors will not tolerate disrespect. They will not accept exploitation, and when they rebel, they are devastating. The Batavians proved this. They showed that Rome's greatest strength, its ability to recruit and deploy foreign warriors, was also a vulnerability. Because those warriors had agency, they could choose. And if Rome pushed them too far, they would choose rebellion. The title of this story asks why Roman generals avoided the Batavians. The answer is layered. They avoided them because the Batavians operated outside normal command, because they answered to emperors rather than to generals, because their reputation intimidated even Roman troops, because their independence made them difficult to control, and because, after the revolt, everyone understood that the Batavians were capable of turning on Rome. This was not about fear in the sense of physical danger. Roman generals were not afraid to fight, but they were afraid of losing control, of commanding troops that might not obey, of relying on warriors whose loyalty was conditional. The Batavians embodied this fear. They were the best, but the best, if not carefully managed, could become the worst. And Roman generals, pragmatic and cautious, chose to avoid that risk when they could. They used the Batavians when necessary, but they preferred troops they understood, troops that fit into the hierarchy, troops that would never question orders. The Batavians questioned, and that made them dangerous. The linguistic legacy of the Batavians is minimal but present. Some Batavian words entered Latin, military terms, names for equipment, descriptions of terrain. These words were absorbed into the Roman military vocabulary, used by soldiers across the empire. Long after the Batavians themselves had faded from prominence, their language survived in fragments, in the terminology of warfare, in the names of places in the Rhine Delta, in inscriptions on altars and tombstones. This linguistic evidence is another reminder of the Batavian contribution to Roman military culture. They were not just soldiers, they were innovators, teachers, influencers. They shaped how Rome thought about warfare, how Rome organized auxiliary troops, how Rome defended its frontiers, and that influence outlasted the Batavians themselves. Long after the cohorts were disbanded, long after the warriors were forgotten, the ideas they introduced remained, embedded in Roman military practice, transmitted to future generations, influencing how Rome fought its wars for centuries after the revolt. The relationship between the Batavians and other Germanic tribes was complex. The Batavians were part of the broader Germanic world. They spoke a Germanic language. They shared cultural traditions with other tribes. But they were also different, because they had partnered with Rome. This made them suspect in the eyes of other Germanic peoples. Were the Batavians traitors, collaborators, or were they pragmatists, making the best of a difficult situation? Different tribes had different views. Some admired the Batavians, saw them as successful, wealthy, powerful. Others despised them, saw them as Roman puppets, betrayers of Germanic independence. During the revolt, Civilis tried to mobilize these other tribes. He presented the rebellion as a Germanic uprising against Roman oppression. And some tribes joined, the Treveri, the Lingones, others, but many did not. They remembered that the Batavians had served Rome for generations. They doubted Batavian commitment to Germanic freedom. They suspected correctly that the Batavians were fighting for their own interests, not for a broader Germanic cause. This limited the revolt's reach. It prevented it from becoming a general uprising, and it ensured that when Rome struck back, the Batavians stood largely alone. The technological exchange between the Batavians and Rome was bidirectional. The Batavians learned Roman engineering, how to build forts, how to construct siege equipment, how to maintain supply lines. They took this knowledge back to their homeland, used it to strengthen their own defenses, to build infrastructure, to improve their settlements. Rome learned from the Batavians too, river crossing techniques, amphibious assault tactics, how to fight in marshland, how to use water as a weapon. This exchange was one of the benefits of the partnership. Both sides learned from each other. Both sides became more effective. But it also made the eventual conflict more dangerous because the Batavians knew Roman techniques and Rome had trained them. When the revolt began, Rome faced an enemy that understood Roman warfare as well as Rome did. An enemy that could anticipate Roman moves, counter Roman strategies, exploit Roman weaknesses. This made the Batavians far more dangerous than a typical barbarian tribe. They were not learning Roman tactics through observation. They had been taught, trained, equipped by Rome itself. And they used that training against their teachers. The Batavians remind us that military prowess alone does not determine outcomes. They were the best fighters in the Roman military. They won battles that others could not, but they still lost the war, because wars are not won by individual battles. They are won by resources, by strategy, by the ability to sustain effort over time. Rome had all of these. The Batavians did not. So despite their skill, despite their courage, despite their initial victories, they could not prevail. This is a lesson that echoes through military history. Elite troops can win battles, but they cannot win wars. Not alone. Not against opponents with vastly superior resources. The Batavians proved this, and in proving it, they became a cautionary tale. For warriors who believe that skill is enough, for tribes who challenge empires, for anyone who confuses tactical excellence with strategic invincibility. The Batavians were tactically excellent, but strategically they were doomed from the start. They just did not know it yet. Or perhaps they did. Perhaps Civilis understood that the revolt could not succeed, but chose to fight anyway, because some things matter more than victory. Honor matters, dignity matters, self-respect matters, and sometimes you fight not because you can win, but because refusing to fight would be worse than losing.